Morning, everybody. My name's Dave. I'm an alcoholic. I'm sober through the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and for that I'm truly grateful. This is an honor. I wasn't nervous outside in the hall, but it took on a new flight a few minutes ago. When they started with the tradition in the steps, I said, "Uh-oh, I'm next." But I'd like to share with you in a general way what it used to be like, what happened, and what it's like today. And I didn't wind up here by accident. I've been around alcoholism most of my life, as I know it today. Before, I thought it was just people having a good time. I grew up in an area, West Philadelphia, where I was born and raised, and at that time it was the city of brotherly love. It was the times where you could leave your front door open. It was times where the neighborhood took care of everybody's child. So if you did one thing wrong, everybody knew it and everybody punished you for it. It's a lot different for me today. But growing up in West Philadelphia, I was one of those curious kids. I guess from early as I can remember, there was always alcohol in my household. My dad drank on the weekends. My mom didn't. She was always sick with asthma basically every year when I was a kid. She spent most of her time in the hospital in between West Philadelphia and Williamstown, New Jersey. That's where I spent most of my time growing up. I was fortunate enough to have a grandmother that loved all her 200-something grandkids, and they would all try to fit in that house on the weekend, But I'll tell you, at the age of 7, my life took a little twist, Unfortunately, some things happened to me that I was molested at the age of 7, and I sort of shut down, and from that point on I took my first drink, I felt most different from those other 200 grandkids in my family. I felt that I was a freak, that why should this happen to me, and I walked around with a lot of pain and a lot of guilt, and the guilt, I didn't know why I had a lot of guilt, but I knew whatever it took place wasn't supposed to, and I was ashamed, and I was ashamed of me and everybody else, and fear set in. And from like the age of 7, I lived with nothing but fear until I took my first drink. I feared anybody and everybody. The milkman, the newspaper man. You ring the doorbell, I'd go hide. That's the way it was when I was a kid. The magic when I turned 13. We were still having all those parties in our house, and every weekend we'd have these. I guess you could call them rent parties. I guess that's what they call them, because my dad was what I call a functional alcoholic, and my mom always needed to find a way to pay the rent. And so she would sell dinners and have parties, and they'd sell booze, and after hours, after the bars closed, and I guess I kind of enjoyed the excitement, because along with the excitement came people dancing and having a good time, and you're doing things for people, and they give you money, and you get out there and dance and stuff like that. Go little David, go. But I always wanted to be accepted, but I never felt quite good, after what happened to me. But around 13, I started noticing the guys at the corner bar. Like in my neighborhood, there was a bar just about on every corner, not every other corner, but every corner. And I noticed these guys had these huge, long cars, big Cadillacs, and rings on their fingers, and always had the prettiest women in the neighborhood, and I said, that's what I want to be when I grow up, I didn't know what it was, but it looked good, But I admired guys that looked tough, that ran numbers and all those type things, And I used to hang around a lot of people that did that, so I was trying to find a way to fit in any way so that I wouldn't have to think about me. Any way I could try to fit in, I did, But along the way, I stumbled along 18 friends, and anybody who knows Philadelphia, there's a lot more people than 18 people in Philadelphia, but I wound up with 18 friends in a 4-block radius, my fear would not allow me to move further than that. At the time I was growing up, there was a gang era at the time, and if you strayed too far from where you lived, you either joined the gang or you became a statistic. And once again, fear set in. But the one thing I was fortunate that I come from a huge family in Philadelphia, about 300 or 400 people, and most of my other cousins around my age were all gang members. So I was fortunate. I could go basically anywhere and not get beat up and watch my friends get beat up, And one of the interesting things that I liked being around the gangs in my area because they had all the women, they had all the money, all the sharp clothes. And in my high school years, we always tried to be like the best dressed kids in school with alligator shoes and silk and wool pants and high boy shirts and all these type things. You go to school, clean as the Board of Health, and drink wine about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and throw up all over yourself and come home. But I looked good before I did that. I had an image. Early on, I had an image. I saw the image that I wanted. First of all, I wanted the big car, the rings, the money, the girls, and I picked up another thing, hot rod. That went right along with that whole thing, and then I could fit. I went from the bars to the garage to being a grease monkey, hanging around hot rod garages, and this was all my life so that I would never have to look at me, But along that time, I guess I was about 14 years old. I used to work construction work a half a day because my high school that I went to, we had so many kids in the school. I think it was like 6,000 kids in one school, just all high school kids. And I went to school from 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning. It's a great time for a drunk, But I used to do construction work with my dad. And I remember he said, to be a man, you gotta be responsible. And I remember every Friday that, on Friday, they became real responsible. Each one of them would get paid and they would buy these little packages, and they were all selfish though. Each one bought their own bottle, I didn't understand that, but along the lines of like when I was working, my dad said, you can have a drink as long as your mother don't know. Well, I really hadn't drank per se a whole lot. I mean, I could take a couple of drinks and act stupid and silly. But I bought a bottle of MD 2020. And I was running a jackhammer at the time, and I thought the best place to hide this stuff was in the compressor. So this stuff was about 100 and something degrees when I drank it. And I remember him distinctly telling me, you make sure your mother don't find out about this. Well, that evening, they carried me in the house. I don't know what he told her, but, and I remember the feeling of that. I remember how that made me feel, I felt like I was about 21 at that time, and I was with all my cousins, and I was fitting in once again. But, there's something about me that every time I was alone, I really felt alone. I would always go back to what was inside, and I never thought there was anything inside that I was good for me, But I guess around the age of 15 and 16, it was just drinking to have fun with the fellas, Every Friday night you get dressed up in your khakis and your Converses and go stand on the corner and drink, throw up, and fight each other. They called it the Rams back then, I thought that was a real thing when you called the Rams when it's fighting, But that's what I did as a kid, and I enjoyed that because it took me out of me. I spent most of my life trying to get out of Dave because I never wanted to be in my own skin. I'd be anything you wanted me to be, except for be me. And that's what I proceeded to do over the next years of my life. And I guess around 16 years old, in my 11th grade, they have this thing called the prom. And there is where, everybody gets dressed to kill, and, and my wife, which was she wasn't even I wasn't even seeing her at the time. I was going with my best buddy's girlfriend, sister. And she made me mad, so I went and asked who my wife is today, a friend of mine, would she go on to prom with me, and that helped me. She said yes. And once again, it did something for me inside. Somebody wanted to be around me, wanted to be with me. She said no, I don't know what I'd have done, because I had to make sure my 18 fellow friends knew that I was able to do this and get women and do things like that, So when she said yes, like, that was the dream of my life, I never knew it was going to last 22 years, When she said yes, I immediately went home and started planning, what this was going to be like. And I had no idea what you do on a prom. All I know is that I had to rent a tuxedo. And those years were good for me. I met this beautiful young lady, unharmed, and I wasn't really that silly myself, but I knew if I took a drink, things would change that evening. And they did. I became, Don Juan, the lover, and everything else in that one prom evening, But, she was a real soldier. I mean, she was real nice, And there was something different about her than most people I used to hang around with, She had she had some etiquette, Most people I hung around with just didn't give a damn about anything. And, and I saw that in her, her family was different from mine, they lived like a whole different lifestyle, they spent all day cleaning, mine spent all day partying, It was just totally different. She lived on one end of the block, I lived on the other, or right around the corner, and I used to throw rocks at them, when they were younger, go through their neighborhood and rip out the banisters at night when we get drunk, never thinking that this was going to be one of my good places to be at, But she meant a lot to me at that time, and I remember, as much as I wanted to be a part of her, I had 18 friends, and these 18 friends would do anything and everything that, if you got them drunk, they'd do anything, But sometimes it took a little persuasion, but. Sometimes I think I like my 18 friends more than I like my fiancée at that time, because I never had to disclose anything. All I had to do was drink, shut up, and not say anything. And if it did say something, you just punch somebody. That was my way of life, or get punched, for saying the wrong things at the wrong time. But her family was totally different, I would show up at her doorstep after the prom, after we came back from the prom a couple of weeks later, and my all dirty outfit, my little skull cap, looking just like somebody should be under a bay somewhere in the garage. And her father used to just look at me, where did this character come from, I never thought that you had to dress up to go see somebody, I was being a realist, who I am, I like cars, women, drinking, and booze, and that's what my life, it was just surrounded by that all the times, but I liked her. And she became a real integral part in my life at that time, And some days I didn't even drink early in the day because I wanted to be around her. One of the things, I could drive her to school every day and made me look good. See, it was all about making me look good because I felt bad in the inside. Even in high school, if I was walking with her, she was a majorette, so I looked good again. I wasn't in anything. I'd go to school and just sleep. Matter of fact, I remember my algebra teacher telling me, "You'll never make it anywhere in life." That was her cousin or something, But that's how my life was. It was just a big dream, I just drank to escape life, to escape people, and I just would wish most things would just disappear, And I remember in my senior year of school, thinking about graduating from high school. What life was going to be like for me after that, and I had no clue. Matter of fact, I put in my yearbook that I'd like to be a truck driver and just keep on trucking. That's all I wanted to do, I had no idea what I wanted to be in life, But right after I graduated high school, I figured I had done the American thing. I went to school, I graduated, I got this beautiful young lady riding around with me. By all standards, I thought I had the American dream. but what I also had was alcoholism in the makings. What I understand is today, I just hadn't got sick as I could have been yet. What started to take place is I started to drink more. I started to wind up in a lot more embarrassing situations, either on her block or anywhere I went. I'm the type of guy that I go to McDonald's at 2 o'clock in the morning, they don't let me in, they pistol whip you. Because you want to go to the bathroom at 2 o'clock and they're closed, and I got a right to be in McDonald's at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the manager thinks otherwise, and I realized that was the alcohol, that wasn't me. A lot of times I felt embarrassed, the things I did, I wouldn't tell people things I did, because they say, you're just a plain fool, and they wouldn't say it, they wouldn't blame that on alcohol, but deep down inside, like I said, I wanted to just fit in anywhere, with anybody, But as life went on for me, life got pretty good. I had a job working in the hospital from 4 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon. It's a great job for an alcoholic, Nobody ever knows you work, and you can drink all the rest of the day and half the night and still go to work, It's kind of tough, though, when you buff floors and you're drunk. You ever been beat up by a buffer? I used to think about that, get jacked all up in the corner by a buffer, and one of the nuns got to help you. But I'm a man, I can handle this, I used to think about a lot of silly things that I did, but that buffer was about the worst. It looks like somebody's actually working you over, But, I remember when I worked at the Fitzgerald Mercy Hospital, how the nuns really took a liking to me. They would always come by and talk to me. At 5 o'clock in the morning, you really don't want to talk to nobody. And they would sit and talk and tell me that greater things were going to happen for me in life, And it's like, they got to be out of their mind. I'll be buffing these floors the rest of my life, But things did happen for me. I guess when I turned 20, well, we got married when we were 20, I think. We got married in 1977, and I remember working at the hospital, and we moved outside of the Philadelphia area. And when I moved, I had all intentions of starting a new life with this wonderful lady, because believe me, she is a wonderful person. She always has been. And we moved into this little place called Berkeley Square. It was about 10, 15 minutes away from where we lived, growing up, And by all means, we had the American dream. We had everything we needed. I had me, I had her, I had a great job, and we had a beautiful apartment, and life was really going good for us at that time, But the one thing that I missed was my 18 friends. And I knew they missed me. They needed me. So when she would go to sleep, I would go look them up. They were always in the same place, sitting in the back of a horse stable. We were fortunate that with the block I hung out on, we had a horse stable with a car garage and a couple cowgirls, and that's basically where I hung out at. But the whole time, our first year of marriage, things were really great. I don't think alcohol had really taken its major toll yet. It's the loneliness inside and the emptiness inside that I started feeling that I continued to drink more. Because even though I finally had married this wonderful woman and had somebody with me all the time, I still felt empty inside. I was the type of guy that, I would pray, but I just say, God, thanks for protecting me today. Short prayers, nothing, ask for nothing, But my wife was like a different type person, and I could see, she had all kinds of plans to do all kinds of things. She wanted to do all kinds of things. And I wanted to be that person that could provide all those things, as long as it didn't interfere with my 18 friends. So right there I'd set up a certain boundary that no matter what happened, I needed to be around these guys to let them know I was still part of the crowd, And part of the crowd means that I just wanted to be able to drink the way I wanted to. And that's what the crowd meant for me, being able to drink and get drunk anytime I wanted to, And the crowd for me, God bless them all. They helped me do a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have done. Things that I don't even discuss anymore because sometimes the statute of limitations ain't up on certain things. But I do know that at a point in time, if it wasn't for those 18 friends, I was thinking a lot of things because of the emptiness inside of me. I thought suicide. I just thought I wasn't worth anything. Even though God had given me all these great things like a wonderful wife, a home, a career, for some reason inside, Dave did not feel he was worth anything. I just had the gifts of life, but I didn't have the feelings or the emotions to go along with it. By my standards, I would say I was about still 7 years old as far as mature-wise, But for some reason, at this hospital one morning, I remember the nun telling me things were going to get better for me. And I went home that day, and I got a phone call from this job that I had filled out an application for about 6 or 7 months earlier. And they called me, and I was half drunk, and the lady asked me, she said, this is a Mobile Oil Corporation, and we're looking for Dave Madison. I said, I don't need any home heating oil. I live in an apartment. And she said, we're not trying to sell you any oil. We have a job if you'd like it, And to tell you the truth, I didn't even know where this company was, I had filled the application out, I guess, about a year or two before. And for some reason, I believe it was those nuns praying for me in that hospital that better things would happen for me. And I went and took this interview, and they told me there was 2 things I needed to do. Not fight and show up for work, and you'd have a job for the rest of your life. And I said, wow, something strange about this, And I'll tell you the truth, that's all you had to do back then, was not fight and show up. No matter what condition you was in, that's all you had to do was show up, So life got better for us, Things got better, my drinking got better. I started drinking better booze, hanging around better people in different bars, Instead of hanging around the horse stable all the time drinking, I hung in this place called the Outer Space Club. Most people were out of space, But life got a little better for me, as things got better, And by all means, once again, I was living this American dream. Just like the nun said, things would get better for me if I just do what I'm supposed to do, But having the American dream and having this disease creeping up on you, it don't work. Because no matter how much you get or what you get, the only thing I wanted was alcohol. Because that's the only thing that took me out of me. I think I spent most of my life escaping Dave. Not people, just Dave. People I could just walk away from, but I couldn't walk away from what I felt in the inside. And what I felt in the inside was what I kept drinking over, Dave, you're never going to be anything. You're never going to do anything. You're a freak. I mean, this is why things happen to you, And I used to hear these little voices, and I used to think, well, the picture One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I could play that, I heard all that stuff, But the bottom line, the quick remedy to get rid of that, get drunk early and often. And with this job, I was capable of, the lunch boxes that you get, the plastic gray thermos lunch boxes, they hold a 6-pack of beer real nice and tight, and you just put a pint bottle in your back pocket, and you're set for lunch. I think the first 10 years of my employment there, I don't think I ever took lunch. I took booze, because it was a haven for drunks and alcohol and addicts. I worked with a lot of boiler makers and a lot of pipe fitters, and neatest thing you do, every break you get, you go drink. So this was no more than moving from the stable to a big company. I had more people to drink with and more so-called friends, and they seemed to like me, because I was just quiet and all I did was drink, and after a while I'd make a fool out of myself, and they seemed to like that type of stuff, So I thought I was in and doing that, but I guess, in 1978, our first son was born, and at that time I really do believe that alcohol was starting to take a toll in my life. And I worshiped my son when he was born. I'd sit at home. At this time we made a geographical move and moved to New Jersey. Once again, it was a real nice place, real nice people, and I used to take care of my son, and and I remember changing his diaper one day, and I had the thought, well, if I smoke a joint and get a sip of beer, he'll be all right laying right there. And the next thing I heard was this flump. He rolled off the bathroom cabinet to the floor. Most people would rush, but I had to continue doing what I was doing. And then I went and picked this child up, and that used to haunt me thinking about that, and we got a joke out of it now in our house, Dad let you hit the floor, he don't know why though, because my alcoholism came first. I didn't want him to see me drinking and using marijuana at the same time, so I thought it was a good idea if he stayed in the bathroom and I went back in the living room, and I could see where alcohol had started to really creep into my life, it started to take a toll on me, because it became, I was a slave to it by then, it meant more to me than basically my kid. Instead of doing the right things of changing him and then bringing him back in there, I figured changing a messy diaper, that's going to take a little bit of time, So I went and did what I needed to do, and I heard that thumping, that always sticks with me, whether something happened to him, But, along that lines is that I was just getting sicker. I'd hang out, and I'd do embarrassing things when we would go out, when you're supposed to be with your wife, you're supposed to be at your wife. I'd do dumb things that would draw attention, and it would be embarrassing for her and my relatives, like I used to go to this place that was called Nicholas Park, and I can't swim at all. But if I took a drink, I'd become this diving champion. I'd take off all of my clothes and go for a run and start, So I had some other problems beside alcohol, and people used to come and get me out of the pool because they knew I couldn't swim, I'd go out there and die in the pool, But those are the stupid things that it would come to my mind, I would do it. And later on you'll see what things that used to come to my mind. I'm glad I didn't do. But as time went on, our little family grew. My son started going to school. I was able to teach him to ride a bike, and do different things. And I remember taking him to the park, and on his first little bike, I took him to the biggest hill in the park. I said if he had a good running start, all he had to do is stay up. And he went down the hill, and he was just cruising until he looked back. And I'm standing there with a beer in my hand. Good job. I couldn't be separated from alcohol at that time. Wherever it went, I went. If I had to do something with the kids, I had a beer, or I had, as my wife say, I had this little flash, in my coat pocket. But wherever I went, alcohol was always there. But there's one thing I truly loved my son when he was born. And alcohol couldn't take that away. I just couldn't give him the time that I wanted to give him, And as time went on, our family things got better, And then there was a point that things started to fall, And I can't tell you what point that was, but things started to change, because I'd started to become really irritable, restless, and discontent. I'll tell you, there'd be nights that I'd be laying in the bed, and I wonder why God had me here, Instead of being grateful that I have everything that every man needs in front of him, I was still looking for more, And I come to find out that one of the things Dave was still looking for was how to accept Dave on life terms, But a few years later, we had a daughter, and when it comes to my daughter, it's a whole different story. And the reason I say that is because I was not in love at that time. I wasn't in love with anybody or me. I was in love with alcohol. When my daughter was born, it took me some time to get to the hospital, because I had to bring a few friends with me, and they stayed out in the parking lot while I went inside, And I remember when my daughter was born, I didn't know it was a daughter at that time, but I knew it was born. And I remember calling my mom, telling her we had a baby, and she asked me what it was, and I tell her I'll check. And there was something wrong with that whole picture that night. And I don't know what I was drinking, but something was wrong. But and I remember my wife asking me, was I happy? And I couldn't answer that. No, I wasn't happy. Like for one thing, this baby was in the way. I wanted to party that night, and that baby was in the way of me partying that night. And the look I saw on her face was not a pleasant look. But like anything else, I just go get a drink and forget about it. But life started to change at that point, and for me, the emptiness set in more. I started to realize that I was no good with her, and I'd be no good without her. And it was just a hopeless situation. But for some reason, I just continued to drink. And shut down, withdraw. I even started to withdraw from my 18 friends. I found new ones because my 18 friends no longer understood the way I was feeling, because they used to tell me, you should go home and be with your family. And I just look at them like they got to be nuts, But that's where alcohol has started to deteriorate my life, and I was on a downward spiral. But, the next year, over the events of the next year, we had a separation for a few months because of my selfishness. I remember her standing in the living room one day and beating me in the chest, and she thought it was over a $7 money order. I had a $14,000 check, and she thought it was a $7 money order. I was going to have a good time, and I remember like, what's wrong with her, And the problem was, it was what was wrong with Dave. It wasn't anything wrong with my wife or my kids. It was what was wrong with Dave. And Dave didn't have, I guess, the insight to see that he was on his way downhill. Dave didn't know what was going on. Dave was too afraid to ask. Once again, fear set in, bewilderment, terror, and frustration, the four horsemen. And Dave was just screwed up. And, and I was asking God why this had to happen to a guy like me. And shortly after that, my wife sort of just, we lived in a household, but we didn't live in a household. She lived upstairs, and I basically lived in the basement. And what started to take place is when she would come to the top of the steps, I'd stand at the bottom of the steps like this. Like this is off limits to you, And that's where I did a lot of my last drinking, in my own dungeon, my prison, where I'd peek out the windows to see if anybody was watching. But things just got worse for me, and she came home one day, and I knew that I was, basically done. And I thought I was done. I had that hopeless feeling that morning, and I pulled out the yellow page phone book, like most alcoholics probably do, and I circled these things called like the Valley Forge Addiction Center, and this other place called Jeffrey down at 2nd and Girard, and because I didn't know anything about alcoholism, so I just looked up rehabs, and I came across these names, and I thought everything would be better if I circled these and left the book on the table where she could see. I was trying for sympathy now, and I told her I think I got a problem, and she looked at me like, "What are you talking about? Like you just need to stop drinking. I can't do that, at least not by myself, And I had a few more episodes, and I guess about 2 weeks from that, on a Sunday night in April, I called my supervisor up, and I had heard that he had once had a problem with other substance, and he found a way up and out of it. And I called him, and he said, "Sure. I can help you do anything you want to do, He said, "Are you drunk?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Well, can you make it to my house?" I said, "Just tell me where it is, and I'll be there." And so I wound up over in a place called Pittman, New Jersey. And he took me to this church. And when I got to the church, this isn't what I was looking for, I went inside, and they had all these people in sheets and white robes, this baptism going on, and I saw that tank. Oh, no, not me. He said, no, that's not for you. He said, I just want you to meet some friends that found their way up and out of their addictions. And these people came around me and surrounded me, and and they started praying. They put all their hands on me and pushed me to the floor and started praying for me. And, I didn't know what was going to take place. But tell you what, it felt good when I stood up when they let go. But it did feel good in the inside. I felt good in the inside for that few moments. But like any good alcoholic knows, a few moments is not enough. I had to drive back to Philadelphia. And I had like 30-something miles to think about this whole thing and what just happened. And so by the time I got to the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, and I was probably only 15 miles away, my car made the same turn it always made, straight to North Philadelphia, which is called the Badlands today. And I went straight back to my old running grounds. I thought what they did for me that night would stop me from drinking. I wanted to stop, but I didn't have the willingness or the courage, because I didn't know what I would do if I stopped, So what happened? I went back and did what I normally do. I drank and went home. And I told my wife, I said, tomorrow morning I'm going to turn myself in to the medical department and maybe they can help me. And she said, well, maybe they can. And she started to look like, maybe it ain't that bad. I think she had forgot there for a couple of minutes, But I turned myself in the next morning. I went to work, and I told them that I needed certain things. First of all, I didn't want to go where somebody would notice me, I put out qualifications on this whole thing. I don't want to go nowhere in Philadelphia because I might know somebody. And so she sent me to a place called Chit Chat up in Reading, Pennsylvania, and what they had up there, and I got up there, it was the longest ride of my life, too. I passed all these nuclear plants and cornfields, and so I didn't know what sobriety meant, but I knew it just took too long to get there. And I got up there, and my 5 sisters, my mother, and my wife, they all took me up there, and the guy said, well, who has a problem? Well, I immediately turned and looked at them. You could tell where their eyes were, So he said, say your goodbyes, but on the outside they had this huge sign, and I thought it was quite embarrassing. It says, if you want to stop drinking, that's our business, but if you don't, that's your business. I said, why would somebody put that on their front lawn? What kind of advertisement is that? To tell you the truth, I did not want to stop drinking. I wanted the pain to go away. I didn't want to stop, because that was all I functioning to relate with people. And they took me in, and this guy came down with one ear. And, I started thinking, well, if I talk on that side, he won't hear me. The sickness of my disease. And he heard every word I said. And he called down my roommate, and this guy came down and looked like Don King with this hair going straight up and his eyes popping out. And I thought I was in trouble. And I looked around, and everybody was shaking and rocking, and like, oh man, I got a serious problem here. And he told me I would be all right. And I went upstairs to my room that night, and my roommate was a guy by the name of Paul from Annapolis, Maryland. And he was the nicest old gentleman I had ever met, and he explained to me why he was there. He was at the throes of his life. He was the corporate president of this company he worked for, but he couldn't stop drinking. A very serene guy, would just sit and write poetry all the time and then read it to me. I thought something was wrong with him, but, he just had a problem with drinking. And he told me, he says, if you really put an effort in this, man, you'd be surprised what could happen. I'm like thinking, he's telling me this and he's sleeping right next to me. So you don't always believe what drunks say. Yeah, I believe you show me. I'm from Missouri. You got to show me, But he was right, But it took me 2 weeks in that rehab to figure out why I was there. And this little lady, I guess about 4'9", from Hanover, Pennsylvania, she came up to me in a crowd of 60 people, and she said, "My God, are you a movie star?" And I didn't say anything. She said, well, say something, We all want to know what you're doing. You've been sitting here for 2 weeks under sunglasses and a beard. We thought maybe you were famous or something. Needless to say, I was embarrassed, And I just told my name is Dave, and I had a problem with alcohol. And she said, well, why don't you join the crowd instead of standing on the outside? And she said, I think Dave needs to say something, And like, oh, man, you want to talk about fear setting in? I think I was soaking wet by the time I stood up, I was shaking, and she said, go ahead. All of us got the same problem, so you're not unique. I didn't know what unique meant at that time, I just knew she was talking about me, but I stood up, and I just moved back and forth and shaking, and I said, my name is Dave, and I think I might have a problem. And about the next 2 weeks, I became a model patient. I started going around being a therapist and helping people, tell them what they needed to do, and and thank God for that young lady. She helped me finally admit that I had a problem in front of 60 people, which was something that I wasn't going to do. I was just going to hope that 4 weeks passed and I'd go home. Actually, what I thought about was this brand new sports car I bought that my wife drove away, and she couldn't drive a stick. That's what I was thinking about. But that's where my mind was, still selfish, self-centered, But the bottom line is that they taught me the nature of my disease, and they told me that if I would do the same things, I would get the same things. And they told me that I needed to change, and they told me I needed to change everything around me. And they also asked me, what would I be willing to do? Would I be willing to go to any lengths? And at that point, I was starting to feel good. And I said, yeah. And she said, you might have to leave your family. And I started saying, oh, no, I can't do that. And the lady said, well, if you leave your family and go get help, you may be of some good to them someday. And I bought that, I might be some good to my family one day. But I didn't know she was talking about 6 or 7 months, But that didn't take place. What took place was on that 30th day, my wife picked me up and took me home. And I had the tools to walk away with. They gave me a big book. They gave me a 12 and 12. They gave me a contact. And I called that contact, and he met me the first day that night, sat out there in a little Chrysler with a Phillies baseball cap and a cigar in his mouth. We had nothing in common, because he's sitting out there. He was prompt, too, just sitting right out in front of the door, and I was like wondering what this guy want with me, and I went outside, after hesitating. I got in his car, and we drove up the street. He cut the motor off about a block and a half away. I said, where are we going? He said, we're going in the church. I said, I can't go in there, man. I live right down the street. People going to know. He said, man, everybody goes in here for everything. Just come on, And I went down these steps, and I looked in the room, and as I walked down the steps, the smoke was just bellowing out from out of the steps, And I got down there, and it was the group I walked into that night was called the West Oak Lane Group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Germantown. And in there they had a lot of old people in there, old women smoking pipes, I looked around and I wasn't supposed to be there. I was only 30 years old, I had another shot according to my records, looking around that room, but I just didn't know how sick I was. And I hear my name out of this smoke being called. And I'm looking like, I'm already scared, and the guy is pushing me through the door. And this guy saying, David, David, David. I'm looking. I look, and here's a guy that I knew was a drunk. He drank with my dad and all, and he was always drunk, falling down. And I never knew. I hadn't seen him in a long time, but he was in that meeting, and he said, "Thank God somebody made it from your bunch." And I sat down next to him, and he told me, he said, there's a couple things you need to do. He said, one, stay away from that family of yours. The other one, stay away from people, places, and things. And he said, the other is make a lot of meetings. And he said, hang in there. And he gave me his number, and he said, I'll be around for a while, that probably helped me because I knew somebody, and I went back the next Wednesday night and the next Friday night. Then I started going to meetings in between. But on my third meeting in Alcoholics Anonymous, I had enough. I had heard enough of sob stories and drinking, and I thought I was well. So on May 17th, I walked out of there on a Thursday night, and I honestly can say I knew I was going to drink that night. I knew it. I'd had a dream about it the week before. I just didn't know that church, it had the long Roman archway that you walk all the way to the street. And I'd seen the whole thing, and I remember this one couple sitting in there saying, "Dave, you got anything you really need to say to us?" And I guess they could see it in my face too. And they said, "You sure now?" And I'm like, "Oh, Dave, I'm fine." And everybody knows what that means, And as I walked through that archway, they kept calling me, "You sure you don't want to talk to us?" I said, "Oh, no, I'm fine." Once again, I went back to my lying, manipulating, cheating, stealing, the same thing, At 10 o'clock that night, at the group I left called No Name, I left that meeting, and 10:45, I was drunk as a hoot owl. Standing in the middle of Germantown Avenue asking God why. I've been to rehab. I went to a couple of meetings. Why? I said, now, if there is a God, somebody help me. And and that was on May 18th of 1986, and I haven't had to take a drink since. And the reason I believe that God reached out and helped me that night. And I need to say this, I believe the obsession and the compulsion to drink was basically lifted that night. I went home, and there's nothing great happened at home besides me walking around with a lot of guilt inside me. No burning bushes, none of that. But the next morning I woke up, I knew I was going to be okay. And life took on a new meaning. I went back to the meeting that night, and there was this guy in there, and I had heard him share before, and I didn't really like him because he was a tough guy, a gangster, and I walked through the door, and he said, "Oh, you drank, huh?" I said, "This son of a gun followed me." He said, "Man, you don't have that gleam in your eye that you had the other day." He says, "Everybody can tell when an alcoholic drinks." He says, "The fear and the terror and the bewilderment sets in once again." And he said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He says, "You don't have to look down. You can look up, man. You dust yourself off and never had to worry about this again." And that guy became one of my first 5 temporary sponsors. I wound up with like the Brady Bunch, It was 4 guys and a woman, It was pretty neat. But these people took me around to step and tradition meetings, and they took me every night of the week to a different meeting. And I remember the one guy, I wanted to say something. And they said, "Dave, what you think?" And the other guy would say, "He don't have anything to say." And I started getting this complex that, they thought I was stupid or something, but they knew what was best for me, and these people loved me till I learned to love myself. They knew what I felt on the inside. They knew the fear. They knew all about me. They could see right through me. And these people began to just love me unconditionally, And I remember we were in this they were in a heated debate, and I decided to butt in. I said, "But," and they said, "There ain't no buts in Alcoholics Anonymous. Just sit yours down." And I was like dumbfounded, like I can't go through this the rest of my life, people telling me what to do, and one day one of the guys called me up. He says, "We got to do a 12-step call." I said, "What is that?" He said, "Now you can ask questions." And I felt stupid once again, But I went on a 12-step call, and we 12-stepped this young girl, and he says, "I'm going to drive, and you're going to tell her how you got here." I said, "For what?" He said, "You're going to help her have the same fighting chance that you had, that we gave you." And so I proceeded to tell her how I got there, Probably shouldn't have elaborated so much, but we 12-stepped there. And we wound up taking her to a detox, and a day or two later, I was wondering how she made out, So I went back to the hospital and asked, "How is Betty?" And they said, "Betty who?" It's the one thing you never learn people's last names. So they had a whole list of Bettys, So I walked away, and I finally realized who her dad was in the program, and he was a real good friend of mine. So I asked him, and he came up and gave me a big hug. He said, "Thanks." He says, "I don't know what happened, but between you and Gary, something happened." He said she's in a long-term rehab up in Reading, Pennsylvania. And I said, "Wow, this stuff does work." If you one alcoholic talking to another, because I just believe you needed a whole group to make that work, like I had. But what had started to take place is I started to get involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. I started to be the coffee maker in my home group, which is the West Oak Lane group, and I thought at that time was the best group in the world. And it may be still real good, even though I ain't there, But they gave me that job of making coffee, and I make coffee better than most people, But, I served as a GSR for that group, and then a group delegate rep for that group. But I served as two terms as alternate GSR, and the reason is that I was not responsible. I used to love sports, and Monday night football is when our district meeting was. And you could count on Dave not being at the first two district meetings. So when election time came to rotate into being a GSR, somebody stood up and said, "Well, he didn't fulfill his commitment." I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute." I said, "I only missed a couple of weeks." They said, "A couple of weeks." We might have needed that message in those couple of weeks. And we feel that you need to do this again. Man, I walked away with the biggest resentment you could get in your life. I said, these people were full of it, but I accepted it again. It was either that or go get a resentment and get drunk, So I accepted being alternate GSR again, and the guy that they gave my job to gave me this card. He said, "Sometimes I think you're a little nuts." He gave me a card for Neurotics Anonymous. But about a year and a half later, he got elected as intergroup chair. So I finally rotated up into my position as GSR, and then I moved in as a DCM for the district. And I just worked in service over the years of my life in Philadelphia, and I enjoyed it, That Saturday morning, starting out about 6 o'clock in the morning, going from one end of the state to the other, and, just being involved, being around people, Knowing I was going to have a good day in spite of whatever took place, because we'd all leave from there holding hands and saying the Lord's Prayer, and everything would get worked out. And, things got better for me. My life got better, I took my wife to her first Al-Anon meeting, the only one I've ever been thrown out of, And I took her there, and my wife made a statement that he hasn't missed one meeting in 3 weeks. And they said, "Well, if he hurry up now and leave now, he won't have to miss this one." I had a little attitude about that one for a while. As I wanted to know what they were going to tell her. Cause I didn't know what Al-Anon meant, or what they did. So I needed to know what they were going to say to her, so I could prepare myself, But that was the best thing that happened to us. So she was able to grow and learn about her, and I was able to learn about me. I kept the focus on me and not on her, And what they brought together was a wonderful reunion. We celebrated 20 years of marriage this year, and that was fantastic, But what I like to say is what took place, in the coming years was the grace of God. I just was allowed to be an instrument. I just showed up, as they say. You show up, suit up, and do what's asked. And one Sunday afternoon, me and my wife, after you start clearing up the wreckage of the past, things start to get good. You start to feel good. You change the carpet on the floors. You paint the house, and everything starts to look gleaming. Then you want to move. Never satisfied, once again, So we did all these things, made our house really a home where we really I really enjoy coming home every night, and bringing my friends and entertaining the people in the program there. And one Sunday, we took a ride to Delaware. And I remember one of my sponsors saying, he said, "Well, it takes 7 years to clear your record, to clear away the record to the past." And I had 6 years, 9 months, and 22 days. I was counting this stuff up back then, and we stopped at a place called Bear, Delaware, and they were building all these new homes. I said, someday we might be able to get one of these, and the lady said, fill the application out, and we filled one out. About 3 weeks later, they told us we were approved. And I was like, oh boy, what happened? My sponsor was wrong. But he just gave me some guidelines how to manage my life, and that's what most people did in Alcoholics Anonymous. They gave me guidelines to live a good life, through the steps and the traditions. I incorporated them in my life, and we moved to Delaware in search of a new start, a new journey, and I tell you, it was a rough road in the beginning. I went to my first AA meeting and felt insulted the first one I was in. This is not AA. I don't know what the hell this is, but it's not Alcoholics Anonymous, And my sponsor told me, he says, well, go back there the next night and put your hand out and reach out. And I said, I did that last night. Nobody put their hands out to me. And he said, well, go back and do it again. So I went back and did it again, and one or two guys walked up to me and welcomed me. And they opened the meeting, and some guy said, he said, I'm a member of Narcotics Anonymous. And I said, oh, shit. I'm still in the wrong place. But here it was. This meeting was a dual-purpose meeting, and I didn't know that, And I left mad, angry, and I went in this search of meetings. I just drove up and down Newcastle County. I'd drive around in the daytime so I could find out where I had to go at night because I was new to the area. And I hit a meeting one night, and a lady by the name of Liz was there, and I shared that I was new, and she marked out all these meetings for me. And so I took her up on her suggestions, and they were okay. They had something to do with AA. Maybe not the way I liked it, but it had something to do with AA. They'd at least read the preamble, if anything. And after that, it would go from soup to nuts. But I stumbled into this meeting in Middletown called the Passing On Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there I met a host of friends that welcomed me from the first day. They reached their hands out to me. They gave me hugs, and they told me, you're in the right place if you're drunk like I am. And I think a lot of people know who they are here. And, what these people did for me, they took away that edge of me searching for another meeting. I finally arrived that I was at home, and they'd had something new to do with carrying the message, passing it on. And that's what I believe my whole intent is to be able to do, is pass things on, not to lock things down to keep them for myself, but to pass it on. I believe it's through God's grace that I'm allowed to just give away what was freely given to me today, unlike I was before I started, selfish, self-centered, But today I know it's His miracle that allows me to operate in life today, And I have but one purpose, and that's to carry the message to the still suffering alcoholic. Any other purpose I have, I don't bring it in Alcoholics Anonymous. No matter what I do on the outside, it's not that important. It's what I do on the inside that allows me to live free each day, free and happy, happy, joyous, and free. I finally realized through working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, I do receive that joy of living. Most times I say something, I usually say that it was a joy to wake up this morning. I didn't come to in the back of a car, or even worse, And one of the things, I've been fortunate in Delaware to be in service in Delaware, and Delaware has, brightened my sobriety. It gave me a lot of hope that things could change. But I love my little state, we made some great changes, some great strides, most of our area committees are functioning today, they quit, but they come back, because I believe we have nowhere else to go. And like I say, my only goal is to make sure that suffering alcoholic still has some place to come to. I honestly believe today this is no longer about me. It's about me being the channel, what they talk about in the 11th step. Me being the channel, being able to listen rather than to be heard, to love rather than to be loved. I believe all those things today that necessarily didn't go agree with me earlier when I first came here. And I believe when I do those things, I receive the full fruits of this program. And that's just a day at a time. I'm not allowed to take a drink, And today I have, my life is built on a spiritual axiom. I believe that it's through my spirituality that I stay sober a day at a time. You know, I can make all the meetings in the world, but I believe if I didn't have a God of my understanding in my life, this thing would not work for me. You know, I'm the type of guy that I need a higher power in my life constantly, because I have one of those minds that suffer from internal intelligence. It tells me I think I know what I'm doing. I know I'm wrong. You know, and that can happen at any given time, believe me, you know. But what I do know today that I've been given a gift that a lot of people won't get. There are a lot of people that would love to have it, but will not put the time in for it. So the only thing I can be is an example. You know, be a trusted servant, serve as best I can, and not try to be a governor. You know, when I was elected delegate, man, I really had a real hat to put on. You know, it just meant me carrying a little more messages. That's all. You know, instead of being at the top of the pile, I'm at the bottom of the pile. You know, I serve the groups. I carry the message back and forth to New York. You know, I spent the greatest part of the last year and a half hanging out with Peggy Arnold and John from Washington and other delegates. And we've had a great time, believe me. I had to speak last year at our nerd convention in Arnold. I was telling him, I don't think I can go in here and do this, you know. It's a whole new crowd of people. He said, you're drunk, aren't you? And he sat down and commenced to tell me a joke, and I thought I needed one this morning to get started, you know. But what I have a little bit different today is I have the grace of God. And that's what allows me to get started each day, you know. And I remember that, you know, I've got it made. Thanks very much for letting me share.
Good job, man.